Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dragonsphere for DOS. This is a point-and-click adventure game by Microprose, released in 1994 to a fairly decent amount of acclaim. People generally liked this a fair amount and said that it was a good adventure game that was just solid and didn't really do anything particularly wrong. At least nothing major. And so what ended up happening was, eventually GOG released the game for free, and that's actually how I got this. I have a link in the video description box if you want to check it out. But, otherwise I wouldn't have even known this game existed, because it's fairly obscure. While there are occasional references to it here and there, you don't really hear much about it because it was kind of lost in the sea of adventure games. And that begs the question, why did it get lost in the sea of adventure games? Well, as far as the visuals go, it was pretty impressive for the time, and the graphics themselves have aged very, very well. It is, of course, 2D and sprite-based, so you actually have quite a bit of detail in the sprites and particularly the animations for the time. There's quite a few frames in the animations, so they're very smooth and they flow together very nicely. And the sprites themselves are very well drawn, so it gives you this very nice sense of atmosphere to the game as far as visuals go. Because everything's so detailed, you're able to really notice how things are different depending on where you are, and you really can see what things are. There's no looking at something and being like, what is that? I can't tell what that is. So that's kind of a rarity for the time. There were a few games that were kind of like that, but for the most part, you would actually have some trouble distinguishing what things actually were. In this game, that is certainly not the case. But as far as the good visuals go, there's also the kind of negative side of this, which is, of course, the sound design. The music is average at best. It's basically standard fantasy-style music, and it fits the game fairly well, but it's nothing particularly memorable. And then there's the voice acting. Now, at the time, voice acting was a pretty rare thing. People were kind of put in awe that it actually happened, because that required a fair amount of disk space, and this was one of those games that came out on CD, and it was new and exciting. But the voice acting in this game is just not very good. Characters read their lines kind of cheesily. They'll say things with the improper tones or very amateurish acting that you just look at and say, yeah, I could probably do better in my own home project or something like that. So they didn't really do a great job with the voice acting. It ends up coming across as kind of cheesy and in some cases kind of over the top just because of the way they talk. But it's kind of nice to have it for that particular time period. But other than that, it's kind of annoying actually, but luckily you can turn it off in the GOG version. I believe the original version of the game, though, was released on floppies and actually didn't have that voice acting, though. So if you have that version, then you probably don't have to put up with it. But anyway, the rest of the sound design is fairly average for the time. The sound effects themselves aren't particularly well detailed, and so it sounds vaguely like what it should sound like, but it's nothing particularly impressive. But ultimately what really matters, the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that the former king of Grand Kalahak imprisoned this evil sorcerer named Sanwi in this kind of magical thing, and the evil sorcerer is starting to break free from that and regain his power. And before the evil sorcerer can regain his power, the current king, King Kalash, has to go and stop him and defeat him once and for all. And so, of course, you play as King Kalash on his quest. And to facilitate this quest, you have to go around the various realms that you are governing and get stones of power as well as these different bits of wisdom that will help you in your quest, and, of course, other items as well as you go through. And there is a plot twist and a secondary plot line to this game, and I'm not going to spoil that for you. But suffice to say, they don't really pull it off all that well. It's not very riveting. The story itself is kind of campy, just all around, not just the secondary story, but the whole story in general. It's kind of campy and standard fantasy stuff of having to defeat the evil sorcerer and save the realm and be the hero. And it's not bad per se, but it doesn't really engross you all that much. Now, I've certainly experienced far worse storylines than this, but suffice to say, it felt kind of cliched, and the dialogue really didn't help. In a lot of cases, it's very cheesy, and the voice acting really doesn't help that. The game does kind of get long-winded sometimes as well, so that's kind of a pain. But that secondary storyline is what kind of put me off at toward the end there, because I was just going, okay, this is where it gets kind of cliche. But they do try to change up a few things here and there. Like the realms that you're governing, you play as the human, of course, and the realms that you're governing are this enigmatic race in Soptus Ecliptus, with their own weird language that you have to decipher as part of puzzles and such like that. The fairies, who you have to deal with, of course, and they're wildly different from humans. And the shapeshifters, who I can't pronounce where they actually live. But suffice to say that that's all weird, and the various environments you're walking around are very different and very just fantastical in a lot of cases, and in other cases they just serve to offer some variety other than standard medieval fantasy thing. And so the change of scenery is somewhat refreshing, but ultimately the gameplay is kind of your standard point-and-click adventure game with a verb system. And what I mean by that is the interface makes you choose a verb, say look at, or open, or push, or something like that. And you click on whatever you want to interact with, like say a door, or just some object you might want to look at, or an object in your inventory. You can also combine things in your inventory with the proper verbs. Now, this inherently creates a bit of confusion, because you may not know exactly what you need to use on what item. Because certain objects will have different verbs required to actually do something properly with them, and others won't. So it's getting used to how that all works, and the interface itself, which is admittedly very clean and very easy to navigate, although the inventory is a bit of a pain sometimes because it's a scrolling list that you have to go through, and it doesn't really order anything, and you have to just go in there by when you got the item in question. So that's a bit annoying sometimes. But ultimately, the interface itself is very easy to work with if you know what you need to do with the given actions or given items, which in some cases is easier than others. The beginning of the game is actually pretty easy to figure out. It's just, you have to go through and experience a bunch of dialogue and get a bunch of information about the various places you're going and the various races that you're going to have to deal with. And there's also some fairly simple puzzles that are easy to go through, and it just takes a bit of quick thinking on your part. But there are certain puzzles in this game that are just outright confusing, and certain puzzles that fall into the cliche market and just get annoying. Now, that's stuff like jumping on various platforms to get to the other side of things in a certain pattern. I hate when things do that. It's not even really difficult, it's just annoying in getting the pattern right. So the game actually does give you a fair amount of freedom when you go in and play it. It lets you go to any of the various areas, but to progress to the culmination of that area, you're going to have to know things that are given in the other areas. So that becomes a bit difficult sometimes, knowing where exactly you need to learn this tidbit in order to get to this next area. And one of the most annoying bits was, in fact, the language of Soptus Ecliptus. There's a certain puzzle that basically, if you don't pay great attention to every bit of dialogue in this game leading up to that point, then you're not going to really know what you need to do. So it's stuff like that that kind of gets annoying and propels the puzzles into a more challenging state. But for the most part, they're pretty straightforward and fairly easy to figure out. Although, in most cases, if you screw up horribly, you will die. And that's a pretty standard feature of classic adventure games. But the game does allow you various choices, like in dialogue, for instance. You can actually choose different responses, and depending on your responses, which in a lot of cases ends up being trial and error, you will either die or you'll progress. So that's kind of annoying sometimes. But once you've figured it out, and you can progress pretty easily, and there's usually some trends to the various dialogues that make it fairly simple to figure out what you're doing. So generally, an experienced adventure gamer will probably have no problems playing through this game, although you may need to consult a hint book or something here and there, particularly with one or two of the puzzles, which aren't that bad for the most part. And the story is not particularly engrossing, but it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just kind of cliche and cheesy in a lot of spots. So the thing is, I can't really recommend getting this game for a price, because it's not particularly impressive. I mean, if you pay a small amount for it, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. but I can't really say it's this must-have game. Luckily, GOG has it available for free. I do have a link in the video description box where you can get that if you're interested. So it's certainly worth checking out just by nature of GOG having it for free. So if it looks interesting to you, if you think you might like it, if you're a fan of adventure games, you might want to check it out. It's certainly a piece of adventure gaming history, and it's not a bad adventure game, but you do have quite a few things you'll need to put up with in order to actually get anything out of this thing. And so I can recommend it to people who are very interested in the genre. I can recommend it to fans of fantasy, even when it's really cheesy. But I can't really recommend it to, say, new players of adventure games, because you'll probably just get frustrated with it, or you'll find it's too cheesy or something like that. But the cheesiness is kind of part of the charm, so it's a bit endearing if you just put up with it long enough. Although there are a few characters who are just annoying to talk to. So if you do like adventure games, if you're looking at this thing and saying, you know what, this looks pretty good, then go ahead and check it out. It's worth checking out based on it being free on GOG. And if you're looking to get into adventure games, though, I would say look elsewhere. Anyway, thanks for watching.